right, welcome to another Duck Dive. This time, we're taking on a figure who needs no introduction, Che Guevara, but we're going beyond that iconic beret and stare, trying to understand him, uh, well, more as a person. We've got some interesting stuff to dig into, biographical snippets, writings on guerrilla warfare, and reflections on his impact, what he meant to the world, all that. So quite a reading list, but hey, we've done the heavy lifting, so you don't have to.
It really is remarkable how his image has taken on this life of its own, almost eclipsing, the actual man behind the myth. So what we're aiming for today, our mission, is to sort of unearth what made Che tick, the motivations, the contradictions, all of it, and see how those ideas, still resonate today.
Yeah, I think that's key, right? Because he's more than just a cool t-shirt image. So let's unpack this, starting with young Ernesto Che Guevara. Turns out the guy was quite the bookworm. I was surprised to learn that. He devoured everything in his parents' library as a teenager. Adventure novels, Greek tragedies, even Karl Marx, all sorts.
Wow. Yeah, no, you can definitely trace like the evolution of his political views through what he read. But Che wasn't just, an armchair revolutionary. His motorcycle diaries, written during those travels across South America, they really show a young man deeply affected by the poverty, the injustice he saw firsthand.
I mean, some people argue those early travels were more about adventure than, deep ideology. What do you think? Those motorcycle diaries, you get this picture of a young guy fixing his busted motorcycle in these remote villages, relying on the kindness of strangers.
Oh, there's definitely a sense of adventure there for sure. But those diaries also show like this growing social awareness in him. There's this one part, his encounter with a displaced mining family in Chile. It really hit him hard.
Yeah.
He writes about their plight with this raw empathy that you can see foreshadowing his later commitments, to fighting for those on the margins.
Right, right. And then there's that time he spent working at a leper colony. Seems like a pretty significant experience for a young man, right?
Oh, absolutely it was. It really solidified, I think, his belief in serving those often forgotten, those on the margins. Lepers were ostracized, feared, and neglected. But Che treated them with dignity, compassion. That theme, standing up for the underdog, fighting for social justice. It becomes a driving force for him throughout his whole life.
Okay, so we're seeing these early hints of the revolutionary spirit, right? But was there a specific event, something that like truly radicalized him?
Well, his time in Guatemala, that was a major turning point, definitely. He witnessed the U.S.-backed coup against the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. And that really opened his eyes to the brutal realities of Cold War politics, and the just devastating impact of American intervention.
So Guatemala, for him, it's like this crucible where his anger, his frustration with the U.S. boils over. I read he even considered joining the Communist Party at that point.
He did. But it's important to remember that Che's communism was always, unique, even a bit unorthodox, you might say. He was deeply idealistic, envisioned a world without borders, without exploitation. And that later led to clashes with Soviet-aligned communists because he felt they were too rigid, too bureaucratic, too focused on holding on to power.
Interesting. So he's disillusioned with the capitalist West and skeptical of the communist East, then enters Fidel Castro.
Yeah, their meeting in Mexico in '55, it was a chance encounter, but it really changed history. You had these two charismatic, driven individuals, both fueled by revolutionary ambition, finding common ground. Fidel, he was already planning to overthrow Batista in Cuba. And Che, well, he was ready to jump right into the fight.
And he wasn't just muscle, right? I mean, he brought serious medical knowledge to that fight. Although treating asthma in the Cuban jungle must have been a far cry from, a sterile hospital setting. So did his medical background actually help him rise within the revolutionary ranks?
I mean, his medical skills were definitely valuable, no doubt. But it was his strategic thinking, his unwavering commitment. That's what really impressed Fidel. He quickly proved himself a gifted tactician, earning Fidel's trust, rising through the ranks.
And this is where those writings on guerrilla warfare come in, right? He wasn't just fighting, he was analyzing, strategizing, almost like writing the playbook for revolution as he went along.
That's exactly it. His book, Guerrilla Warfare, it became like a Bible for revolutionary movements all over the world. And it's not just theory, it's practical, outlining tactics he used himself in Cuba.
So what's an example, like a specific tactic from that book that had real impact?
Well, one of the key concepts he stressed was the FOCO theory. This idea that a small, highly mobile guerrilla force could topple a much larger, better-equipped army. They'd operate in rural areas, gradually gain popular support, essentially a revolutionary spark that ignites a larger fire.
Wow, so like a David versus Goliath scenario where David actually wins?
Yeah, exactly. But as we'll see, the FOCO theory had its limitations. It worked in Cuba, but his attempts to replicate it elsewhere, like the Congo, Bolivia, they weren't as successful.
And speaking of Che's relationship with the Soviet Union, I'm curious about how this FOCO theory fit into that whole Cold War context. Were the Soviets, like, totally on board with his ideas?
Not entirely, no.
Mm.
You got to remember, Che was a true believer in global revolution,
Yeah.
and he criticized what he saw as Soviet complacency, their focus on peaceful coexistence with the West. He believed in actively supporting liberation struggles everywhere, even if it meant challenging the Soviet agenda.
So too radical even for the Soviets.
In many ways, yes. He was deeply suspicious of their bureaucracy, their willingness to compromise with capitalist powers. He even called the Soviet Union another form of imperialism, just, disguised in socialist rhetoric. This growing tension, it played a role in his decision to leave Cuba, pursue revolution elsewhere.
Wow, it's hard to imagine, the revolutionary hero leaving the revolution he helped create. But his farewell letter to Fidel, it's incredibly powerful, this mix of commitment and genuine affection.
You really sense the depth of their bond in that letter. It's almost heartbreaking knowing what lies ahead for him.
And what about his personal life? Was there room for love amidst all the revolutionary fervor?
Oh, absolutely. Chi was deeply devoted to his wife, Elida. He wrote her passionate love letters, even poems, while he was on dangerous missions abroad. In one letter, he talks about dreaming of building a school for little gorillas. It shows a different side to this, often stoic figure. A reminder that behind the revolutionary, there was a complex individual with a deep capacity for love, for tenderness.
So he leaves Cuba, this revolution he helped build, and sets his sights on Africa. Why the Congo? What drew him to that particular conflict?
Well, Chase saw Africa as like the next battleground in the global anti-imperialist struggle. He believed a successful revolution there could have a domino effect, igniting liberation movements across the continent, weakening Western colonial powers.
But he wasn't just offering moral support, right? He was on the ground, leading troops, training fighters.
Yes, he was, but the Congo mission, unfortunately, it was a failure.
Why do you think that was? Why was it ultimately unsuccessful?
Oh, there were several factors. The rebel forces, they were factionalized, lacked a unified vision, the terrain was unfamiliar, and Che himself was struggling with illness at the time. And maybe most importantly, the FOCO theory, which worked in Cuba, it just proved ineffective in the complex political landscape of the Congo.
It's interesting, though, despite that setback in the Congo, Cuba's involvement in African liberation movements continued, especially in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Was that a continuation of Che's vision, or was it more about Cold War politics, do you think?
It's probably a bit of both. For Fidel, supporting those struggles was about solidarity with oppressed people, challenging global power structures, and fulfilling what he saw as Cuba's revolutionary duty on the world stage. So while Che was physically gone, his ideas, his spirit, they continued to influence Cuban foreign policy.
So after the Congo, where does he go next? What's his next move in this global chess game of revolution?
Well, his heart was always with Latin America, and there's one country that held this special significance for him: Bolivia.
Bolivia. Why Bolivia? What was the strategic thinking behind that choice?
Well, this is where things get even more complicated. You got to remember, Che was a man of action, sometimes to a fault. He believed a small, dedicated force could spark a continental revolution. And he felt Bolivia, with its history of political instability, its large indigenous population, it was ripe for change.
But as we know, that wasn't the case. The Bolivian mission, it was a tragedy ending with his capture and execution.
It was a tragic miscalculation. Che overestimated the peasant support, the Bolivian Communist Party was fractured, uncooperative, and the CIA, well, they were actively training the Bolivian army to counter guerrilla warfare.
This is one of the darkest chapters, right? And for years, it was shrouded in secrecy.
Absolutely. Even the location of his remains was a mystery for decades. The Bolivian government buried him in an unmarked grave, hoping to prevent it from becoming a shrine.
And then there's that whole thing with his diary, stolen, smuggled out, published to international acclaim. It sounds like a spy thriller, not history.
It really does. And that diary gives us this incredibly intimate glimpse into his final months. You see his unwavering belief, his growing frustration, even moments of doubt, despair.
It's a powerful reminder that behind the legend was a real human being facing impossible odds, ultimately meeting a tragic end.
But even in death, his legacy continued to grow. He became a martyr, a symbol of resistance against oppression, his image appearing everywhere.
And that brings us to the question of legacy, right? What does Che Guevara mean today? Is he just a cool image, a relic of the past, or do his ideas still hold relevance in the 21st century?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? On one hand, there's the commercialization, the Che chic, which feels disconnected from his actual beliefs.
Right, like seeing his face on coffee mugs and designer handbags. It's kind of ironic, considering his critique of consumerism and materialism.
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, his ideas about social justice, fighting imperialism, creating a more equitable world, those resonate more powerfully than ever in a world grappling with inequality, the consequences of globalization.
So Che's legacy, it's this fascinating mix of contradictions. The romantic revolutionary, the ruthless guerrilla leader, the inspiring idealist, the flawed human being.
Exactly, and it's that complexity that makes him so enduringly fascinating. He wasn't just a figure from the past. He wrestled with the big questions, questions that are still relevant today. How do we fight for a better world? What sacrifices are we willing to make? What does it mean to be human in the face of injustice?
And those are questions that we're going to keep unpacking as we continue our deep dive into Che Guevara.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into his philosophy, his successes and failures in Cuba, and the ongoing debates about his legacy. Welcome back. Where we left off, Che had said goodbye to Cuba, setting off to spread revolution globally. But before we get to that, let's rewind a bit. Go back to his time in Cuba, after the revolution succeeded. He went from guerrilla fighter to holding some pretty significant positions in the new government.
Yeah, it's a wild transition, right? Overseeing executions at La Cabaña Fortress, then becoming president of the National Bank, later Minister of Industry. It's a pretty diverse resume, to say the least.
It does make you think, how does someone used to the battlefield adjust to, economic policy? But this shift, I think it shows something important about Che's thinking. It wasn't just about tearing down the old system. He was deeply invested in actually building something new, a more equitable society.
Some might call that naive, though, right? I mean, how successful was he at actually merging those revolutionary ideals with the practicalities of running a country?
It was a mixed bag, definitely.
Yeah.
But he genuinely tried to put his socialist vision into practice. Worked tirelessly, even joining laborers in the fields, the factories, really embodying that belief in hard work and self-sacrifice.
That reminds me of his famous essay, Socialism and Man in Cuba. Didn't he lay out this idea of the new human being driven by the collective good, not personal gain?
Exactly. You're spot on. That essay, it's a fascinating look into his utopian vision, a more just, compassionate society. He believed people could be motivated by moral incentives, not just material rewards. It's a concept that's been, both praised as visionary and criticized as potentially unrealistic.
And potentially authoritarian, some might say. It's interesting how he still sparks these debates, even today. So was this concept of the new human being, was it reflected in his actual economic policies, and were those policies ultimately successful?
Well, Che faced huge challenges, right? Cuba was under a U.S. trade embargo.
Yeah.
He was struggling to boost production, modernize industries, and his emphasis on moral incentives over material rewards, it didn't always resonate with the workers. There were shortages of essential goods, things like that. He was a big advocate for industrialization, but his efforts, they met with limited success.
So a mixed bag indeed, like you said. It seems his idealism, it sometimes clashed with the hard realities of governing a nation.
Absolutely. But even with all those challenges, he never wavered in his commitment to social justice, to improving the lives of everyday Cubans. He spearheaded literacy campaigns, expanded healthcare, promoted volunteer work. His dedication to serving the people was, it was undeniable.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Talk about his writings on guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare, it became a guidebook for movements all over the world. I'm curious, what made it so influential?
It offered this unique blend of practical advice and ideological inspiration. He drew on his own experiences in Cuba to give detailed instructions on everything, from choosing terrain, setting up supply lines, to winning over the local population.
And you mentioned the FOCO theory earlier. How did that concept fit into his overall strategy for waging guerrilla warfare?
The FOCO theory was central to his approach, definitely. He believed that a small but dedicated group of guerrillas, operating in rural areas, building support among the people, they could create this revolutionary focus that would eventually spread and overcome the enemy.
It's a compelling idea, but it seems to rely heavily on gaining that popular support. How did Che believe guerrilla movements could win over the hearts and minds of the people?
He really stressed discipline, selflessness, exemplary conduct among the guerrilla fighters. He believed they should be like models of revolutionary virtue, living and fighting alongside the people, earning their trust, inspiring them to join the cause. Clear political goals were important, and effective communication to mobilize the masses.
So it sounds like he was as focused on winning the ideological battle as the military one. But as we know, the FOCO theory, it didn't always work out. His experiences in the Congo and Bolivia, those were, well, stark reminders of its limitations.
You're right. The FOCO theory worked in Cuba because of specific conditions, conditions that weren't necessarily present in other places. In the Congo, the rebels were fragmented, lacked a shared vision. In Bolivia, he faced a well-equipped army, trained by the CIA, and struggled to gain peasant support.
It shows that revolutionary struggles are complex, right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. Yeah. Even Che himself began to see the limitations of simply trying to export the Cuban model. His later writings, they show a growing disillusionment with rigid ideologies and a deeper understanding that you have to adapt strategies to specific circumstances.
It's interesting to see that evolution in his thinking, challenging both capitalist and communist orthodoxy, in a way. He became a critic of both the West and the East.
Yeah, that's a key point. He was searching for a third way, a more authentically revolutionary path, one that went beyond those Cold War binaries. And this quest for an alternative, it's ultimately what led him to that final mission in Bolivia.
Which brings us to a pivotal question, I think. How did Che's involvement in the Cuban Revolution shape those later endeavors? And what lessons, what takeaways did he get from his experiences actually being in power?
His time in Cuba was a real test. His revolutionary ideals up against the hard realities of governing, he learned about managing an economy, balancing different interests, adapting strategies. These lessons, both good and bad, they informed his later attempts to bring about revolution in Africa and Latin America.
So it sounds like his time in Cuba was, well, a period of profound learning, but also disillusionment, shaping both his tactics and his ideology. All right, so we're back, and like we said, we're diving into that final chapter of Che's life, his mission to Bolivia in 1966. We know it doesn't end well, but I'm really curious. What made him choose Bolivia? What drew him there?
Well, even after the Congo, Che was disillusioned but not, completely defeated. He still believed a continental revolution in Latin America was possible. And he saw Bolivia with its history of political instability and its large indigenous population, as well as fertile ground for a revolutionary movement.
But it seems like almost from the start, things were going wrong. What were some of the biggest challenges he faced there?
Oh, there are a lot. Getting support from the local peasants proved way harder than he expected. The Bolivian Communist Party was, well, they were more interested in infighting than helping him. And maybe the most critical factor, the CIA was actively training the Bolivian army, specifically to counter his guerrilla tactics.
So it's like he was walking into a trap. And his diaries from this time, they paint a pretty bleak picture. This growing isolation, frustration with his comrades, even moments of self-doubt.
Yeah, reading those diaries, it's poignant. You see that unwavering belief, but also the weight of everything on his shoulders, the isolation and this growing feeling that maybe this time victory wasn't possible.
And then in October 67, after months of hardship, dwindling supplies, Cheese is captured by the Bolivian army with help from U.S. Special Forces.
The exact details of his execution are still debated, but it was quick. On October 9th, 1967, in a small schoolhouse in La Higuera, the revolutionary icon met a brutal end.
It's such a tragic ending, almost Shakespearean. But his story didn't really end there, did it? In death, he became a martyr, his image everywhere, on T-shirts, posters, murals.
Absolutely. His death sparked this global outpouring of grief, admiration. For many, he became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even against incredible odds, one person can challenge the system, fight for something better.
But as we've been talking about, his legacy, it's complicated, isn't it? There's the romantic image, the hero, but also the reality of the violence, the bloodshed. How do we reconcile those two sides?
That's the challenge with any historical figure, especially one as polarizing as Che. We have to acknowledge both the good and the bad, the triumphs and the failures. We can admire his commitment to social justice, his willingness to fight for the oppressed, without, condoning the violence he used.
It's easy to see him as a figure of the past, a product of the Cold War. But how much do his ideas still matter today in the 21st century?
That's the question, isn't it? On the surface, you see his face on everything. Coffee mugs, handbags, this Che chic, which feels almost ironic, disconnected from what he actually stood for. But deeper down, his critique of capitalism, his passion for justice, for a more equitable world, those resonate more than ever, I think, especially in a world dealing with inequality, climate change, the rise of authoritarianism.
So Che's story might have ended in tragedy, but his legacy, that's still unfolding. It challenges us to confront injustice, to imagine a better world, one where everyone can live with dignity and freedom.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring this complex, controversial figure. His story reminds us that the fight for a better world is never over, and each generation has to grapple with those big questions. What does it mean to fight for justice? What are we willing to sacrifice? And how do we create a world where everyone has a chance to thrive?
Great questions to leave us with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the life and legacy of Che Guevara. We hope it's given you some new insights, inspired you to keep exploring history and the power of ideas.